everybody, welcome to Hail State Debate. I'm Brett Harvey, the debate coach for the Mississippi State University Speech and Debate Council, and this is our new YouTube channel where every month we're going to offer analysis and thoughts on the national, high school, Lincoln Douglas, and public forum topics. And also, in some cases, in some videos, just our thoughts and advice on hopefully how to get a little bit better as a debater. And we started off last month with our first video on the NSDA public forum resolution on NAFTA. We appreciate the likes and the subscribers and the comments. This video is about the Novice LD topic that we use every year. So you may be watching this a couple years from now, and hopefully it'll be helpful. But it is resolved: civil disobedience in a democracy is morally justified. We're going to cover that topic in a variety of ways and make sure that you're hopefully prepared to debate it. The goal of this channel overall, in case you're wondering why we do it, is to help make debate more accessible. We really believe that debate is like the single best activity you can do in high school. We want more people to do it, and we think it's a shame that in some cases, at some levels, it feels like maybe it's sort of gated behind jargon, gated behind sort of going to the right camp or going to all the right tournaments. We think it ought to be more accessible at every single level, all the way from your very first tournament to the very highest levels like NSDA, Nationals, TOC, and other tournaments like that. So our goal is to really kind of demystify it, to sort of open it up and make it clear, to explain it in plain language, not to dumb it down at all, to do it on a very high level, but to make it as clear as we can to as many people, because we just think debate is that important and we want more people to do it. This video is going to be a little bit different than most of our videos. Most of the time we're going to have several folks from our team, debaters and or coaches, offering different perspectives on the topic. But in this case, it's the middle of the summer. And that means that we've got just me here on campus. Nobody else is here. They're strewn all over the world. Josh, who you may have seen in our first video, is over in Berlin, and everybody's everywhere else. So I am flying solo because we want to get this video out in time to have people prepare for this topic, because we know folks are already getting ready in June and July and soon after that. Also, apologies if the audio isn't perfect. We don't have all of our fancy equipment with us right now, but I think you'll be able to make it out. So now, if you're watching this, that means you're probably getting ready to go to your very first debate tournament. That's what the novice topic is for. Or maybe you're helping new students get ready for it. Either way, congrats. Debate's an amazing activity. Like I said before, it's incredibly fun. You'll meet amazing people. You'll build skills that you can't build anywhere else. But you're probably kind of nervous if you're new, right? You're probably wondering what you've got yourself into. You may have never seen a debate tournament before. And the goal here in about an hour is to get you to a point where you feel confident that you sort of have your brain wrapped around the topic. You have a basic understanding of civil disobedience, but in addition to that, you sort of understand the parts of the case and some basic concepts for just getting ready to go do your first tournament, so that you can have confidence as you get ready. Because it is a video for new people and new debaters, we're going to pause, or I'm going to pause a little bit more in this video than in other cases and kind of explain concepts. So for example, when we start talking about values and criteria, you may be wondering, what is that for? What does it do? Well, we're going to slow down and explain what those things do in a debate round, hopefully so that it's more meaningful and more useful to you. So like I said, it's a long video, about an hour. Because we have a lot to cover. So we're going to divide it up into 4 sections. You may want to watch one at a time, or watch it all at once. But the 4 sections are: number 1, we're going to do an overview of the topic, an overview of sort of the real world implications of civil disobedience and what it means. Second, we're going to talk about values and criteria, which are the measuring stick that we use in debate to tell the judge, for example, if you say something is morally justified, what do you mean? How do you tell? Well, the value and the criterion help answer that. Third, we're going to talk about definitions of terms and analyzing the wording of the resolution. That's also very important, because that determines, what is the resolution really saying? What goal line do I have to cross to win? And then last, but certainly not least, we're going to turn to the substantive arguments, right? The common substantive arguments that we see in actual debate rounds on this topic. As always, we're going to put timestamps and links to the sources we cite below in the notes, so you don't have to worry to pause or go back or stop to look for those. They'll be there for you. And hey, if you like it, give us a like. If you want to keep up to date on what we talk about and the new topics, subscribe. If there's something we could do better, let us know in the comments. We're always trying to get better. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started with section 1, the overview of the topic. All right, so let's start off by talking about civil disobedience and what it is, and just sort of get an overview. Later on in the video, we're going to get deeper into the sort of philosophical questions of what it means to say that civil disobedience is or is not morally justified, the ways you can argue that. But for right now, let's just wrap our brains around what civil disobedience is, what it has been historically, and what it is today, because I think having that practical understanding is really important. I've judged a lot of rounds where young debaters had an understanding of sort of the philosophical concepts, but really couldn't illustrate a lot of instances where civil disobedience has happened. And I think it's important that you sort of know the practical history of it. You might be wondering where this topic came from and why we use it every year. For a long time, there was no special novice Lincoln Douglas debate topic. It's just that novices used the same topic that varsity debaters did every year, and it worked pretty well. But there was a desire to have a topic that would be a better sort of gateway, a better intro to Lincoln Douglas debate, that would be straightforward, something that would be usable every year, something that's fairly easy to understand but still complex enough to debate. And then something that could be used again and again so that people could start preparing before the topics were announced in August. And civil disobedience, in my opinion, I think is a great topic. It's sort of evergreen. It's relevant all the time, from year to year. It never really goes away. It evolves, but it's something that has relevance and meaning just about every year. And so it was sort of selected a few years ago to serve as the sort of perennial topic, and I think it's a really good one. I think you'll enjoy debating it, and I think you'll learn a lot from it. But civil disobedience, if you sort of look at the dictionary definition of it, and the one we're looking at right now, is just, the first thing that pops up on Google. I would actually not recommend using this as a definition in the round, but just to kind of get us started, what does it mean? Well, it's the refusal to comply with certain laws or to pay taxes and fines as a peaceful form of protest. Now, there's more to it than that. There are more elements to it, but just to sort of throw it out there and get the ball rolling, that's a decent, workable definition just to sort of start the conversation. And civil disobedience has, a very rich history in the United States. And, in most of the debate rounds you do on this, the one example and the one illustration that's going to come up again and again and again, you probably have guessed, is the civil rights movement of African Americans in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s. There are numerous examples, well-known, famous examples of civil disobedience occurring in the civil rights movement, and it comes up as an illustration, usually by the affirmative, in many debates on this subject, because the overwhelming majority of Americans think that the civil rights movement was a positive development. The most famous single example, arguably in history, of civil disobedience is Rosa Parks in 1955 in Montgomery, Alabama, refusing to give up her seat for a white passenger on a bus. This was in violation of a local regulation that said that African Americans had to give up their seats for white passengers. She refused to. And this was instrumental in starting a larger protest called the Montgomery bus boycott. And Rosa Parks became a national hero. This was a rallying cry for many in the civil rights movement. But it wasn't just Rosa Parks. If you look, you'll also see Dr. Martin Luther King there. Dr. King was arrested many times throughout his career as an organizer and protester. In 1963 in Birmingham, for example, he was arrested for defying court orders barring protests, saying that you can't protest, you can't demonstrate. That's actually when he wrote his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, which was one of the sort of major documents in the history of the civil rights movement. But it wasn't just sort of famous people, it wasn't just people who kind of were household names today. You also had many hundreds, dozens, thousands of protesters doing things like you see here, lunch counter sit-ins. Taking a seat at a lunch counter that in the South by law at the time was segregated. African Americans were not supposed to sit at these counters and demand to be served, but many people went in and did just that. And basically, they knew they were going to be arrested. They knew that they were going to be prosecuted for violating the law, but they nonetheless did it. They did it non-violently and peacefully. And that's actually a very important part of the definition of civil disobedience that we're going to talk about later. The idea that for something to be civil disobedience, it can't be violent. You can't say, I'm going to protest the banking laws in this country because I think they're unjust. Well, how are you going to do it? Well, I'm going to go rob banks. that probably would not be considered civil disobedience by any authority or scholar. I'm never one to tell somebody that a topic is not debatable, but most people would say that it's not. But at any rate, throughout the civil rights movement, we see again and again and again civil disobedience as a recurring theme. But it's not just the United States civil rights movement. In fact, Martin Luther King and other leaders of the movement derived a lot of their ideas about civil disobedience from Mohandas Gandhi in India. And Gandhi is sort of the great popularizer of civil disobedience in the 20th century. As you probably know, in the 1930s, when these pictures were taken, India was under the rule of, as a British colony. It was under colonial rule. And, you know, by consensus, this was a very oppressive form of government in which Indians were, in many cases, treated, you know, second-class citizens, subjected to unreasonable demands by the British colonial government. And the most famous example of civil disobedience in India was the Salt March in 1930. And basically what went on with that was the idea that British authorities told the people of India that they couldn't make their own salt. They had to buy salt from the British, and they had to pay these exorbitant taxes that made it hard for people to afford it. Now you may say, salt, yeah, that's no big deal. Yeah, in a first world developed country like ours, maybe it doesn't seem that way, but salt was a staple of people's diets in India. It was a very important nutritional component. And when poor people didn't have access to it, when they had to pay for it, it made it very difficult for them to stay healthy. And so Gandhi organized a march, you know, many hundreds of miles long, to the Arabian Sea, to a town in the Arabian Sea, where he was actually going to walk down to the sea and make, you know, pull salt. There were places where you could, like salt flats, where you could like pull salt up out of it and make their own salt. And by doing that, he would be breaking the law. And he made it very clear along this march that that was his plan. And when he arrived in this town, he had tens of thousands of people with him, and he went down to try to make salt. And by pulling some up out of the sea, right, he had violated British law, and he was arrested. And this set off civil disobedience all over India, right? And eventually, in the long game, almost 20 years later, you know, India became independent of colonial rule by Britain. So this was one of the great examples of sort of anti-colonial response and using civil disobedience to do that, right? But civil disobedience isn't just something that happened throughout world history. It's something that still happens today. So you see the example here. These are protesters protesting the Keystone XL pipeline. You may remember from a few years ago that the Keystone XL pipeline was a major controversy. On the one hand, you had people saying that the United States needed to have it in order to have greater energy independence. On the other hand, you had people saying it was going to be an environmental disaster, that it was going to increase our reliance on oil, lead to climate change. These are protesters of the pipeline, and what they're doing is they're actually out in front of the White House, and they're staging what's called a die-in, and they're literally laying on the sidewalk, you know, sort of refusing to move. Now, there's nothing per se illegal about lying down on a sidewalk, but eventually they were given lawful orders by police to leave, and they refused to obey them, and they knew they would refuse to obey them, and by refusing to obey them, they were engaged in an act of civil disobedience. And so this was a more recent example of, you know, an act of civil disobedience on a current political issue that you can see. One of the more famous ones of maybe 20 years ago, I remember this from when I was in high school, and I was debating the tree sitters. The tree sitters, the California redwoods. These were folks who, to protest and prevent logging and deforestation of ancient California redwoods, they would literally go up and chain themselves or tie themselves or just set up like little tents and hammocks and things in these massive trees, and they would stay there in violation of lawful orders. So courts would say, you're trespassing, you don't own this land, you have to leave, you're breaking the law, and they would say, I'm not leaving until I get some guarantee that these trees aren't getting cut down. This was breaking the law to protest what they saw as an injustice. In this case, it was an environmental injustice. It could be any kind you want, but in this case, you know, that's what it was. And then one other, I think, very topical, very, you know, relevant recent example is this guy is Corey Menifee, and he was a custodian at Yale University. And back in 2016, you can see the stained glass window there. The building that he worked in, which was actually, the building was named after, the college, I guess, was named after a slaveholder. They had this stained glass window, that had pictures of slaves working in a field, and generally, felt like it was sort of a positive, it was sort of a pretty portrayal, almost kind of like bucolic. And he was offended by this idea that you have this sort of positive, nice-looking, happy-looking portrayal of slavery. And one day he went and smashed the window. And he was fired by Yale, but after many protests by students and others, they decided not only not to prosecute him, but actually allow him to come back to work and to have discussions about removing this kind of imagery, or at least placing it somewhere else, on campus. This was an act of civil disobedience because he was breaking the law. He was destroying private property. That was clearly against the law to protest an injustice. Now here, it wasn't an injustice by the government because Yale's a private institution, but it was an injustice by someone else. So a little bit of a definitional issue there, but most people would say that this is a form of civil disobedience. Okay, so far you're hearing these things, and depending on kind of where you come down on the political spectrum, you may be saying to yourself, wow, that sounds great. That's like, those are all good causes. Or maybe you disagree with one or two of them. You're saying, well, they're at least reasonable. There's nothing particularly harmful or bad about any of them, right? But there are historical examples of civil disobedience being used to do really bad things. And, sometimes debaters don't have a real good grasp on these. But I do think it's very important for you to, if you're a negative debater on this resolution, not to just come in and have these sort of philosophical objections about why, for example, Kant's categorical imperative isn't satisfied. We'll talk more about that later, by the way. But like examples of when civil disobedience has been used to do things that we all kind of on a gut level would say are bad. And I don't think there's any better example in American history than this one. This is Governor George Wallace of Alabama in 1963. And in 1963, the federal government issued an order to integrate the University of Alabama to allow African American students to attend it. And George Wallace was the governor, and he was famous for saying segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And in violation of lawful federal court orders and in violation of lawful orders from the president, here he is in this picture, literally standing in the doorway of the enrollment office at the University of Alabama, physically trying to block African American students, the first African American students, from entering and enrolling at the university. This was clearly an act of civil disobedience. He's breaking the law. He's doing it intentionally. He's doing it to draw attention to what he perceives as an injustice. He thinks removing segregation, is an unjust thing. And so this is him attempting to block it in violation, of the law based on what his conscience dictated. Most people, almost everyone today, would say that segregation was a great evil, right? And so this is kind of a palpable example that the negative can cite and say, look, this is a perfect example. Civil disobedience might be used for good, but can also be used for really, really bad, purposes. More recently, and this is not nearly as sort of insidious as George Wallace, but there are other examples of civil disobedience being used for, questionable purposes. This is what was called the Beltway Truckers' Ride for the Constitution. This was a planned protest in 2013. And basically what was going to happen is a lot of these truckers were going to drive onto the Beltway around Washington, D.C., and they were going to slow their trucks so much, right, slow them down deliberately, that they were going to block traffic all around D.C. to create gridlock and make it impossible, I guess, for congressmen and congresswomen to leave town or go where they wanted to go. Now, it ended up kind of flaming out, only a few dozen people showed up, but the idea, the plan was for it to be something that blocked traffic everywhere, and the concern was that this could have had massive harm, right? It could have stopped police and ambulances and emergency vehicles. It could have kept people sitting in traffic if they were trying to get to the hospital. It would have led to thousands of hours in the aggregate of people sitting in their cars, right? And also, you could argue that some of their purposes were pretty bad too. I mean, but the person who organized it called, President Obama literally the Antichrist, and said that he was, a Muslim who was trying to turn the country, into a Muslim country. So, kind of some nutty ideas, not as harmful to society, I guess, as George Wallace, but still an example of how civil disobedience isn't always going to be, something on the order of a Rosa Parks, right? There are other examples, other arguments against civil disobedience. For example, there's the argument that what if everybody did it, right? There's a strong argument that we'll talk about later from Immanuel Kant called the idea of the categorical imperative. If you can't say that something is okay for everybody, then you really shouldn't be saying that it's moral for anybody. If everybody broke the law whenever they disagreed with it, even if they did it peacefully, even if they did it nonviolently, law enforcement would be strained beyond recognition. Society couldn't function. So if not everybody can do it, if it can't be a universalizable rule, Immanuel Kant would say, then it can't be morally justified. And then finally, some people just say that, civil disobedience is obsolete. If you base your justification for something on whether it helps society, like if you say that civil disobedience and the civil rights movement helped society, well then you necessarily have to ask, how much do we really need it? I mean, there's a downside to it, clearly, right? So if the upside has been reduced, then maybe it's not justified. And people argue that there's all kinds of online opportunities, from Facebook to Twitter to change.org, petitions, fundraising. There's so many different ways in the modern world, right, for people to go out and make their voices heard without breaking the law, without potentially leading to obstructions and harms to society, that you really don't need it anymore, so it's hard to say it's justified. So that's a really quick overview of what civil disobedience is. Now the next step is to try to apply it in the sort of world of Lincoln-Douglas debate, which is a world where we use kind of specialized terms and specialized structures. So the next thing we're going to talk about in the next segment is how to use the value and the criterion, right, to explain your case and to make it clear sort of to the judge why you're saying that this concept of civil disobedience is morally justified. Okay, so now that we have a basic understanding of sort of what civil disobedience is, like in the real world, we're going to start the process of trying to take those ideas and put them into the structure of an actual Lincoln-Douglas debate case. And the good thing about Lincoln-Douglas debate cases is the structure is pretty predictable. There's a lot of room for creativity in what you say and how you argue and the specific tangible points that you make, but the structure is more or less predictable. Even at very high levels, really advanced debaters tend to follow more or less the same structure. And it goes something like this. First, there's an introduction and a resolution. You state the resolution. This is usually very, very brief. In many areas of the country, in many circuits, the introduction is really just saying, I affirm the resolution resolved so-and-so, or I negate the resolution so-and-so. In the area where I've worked with high school students, it's a little bit more of an emphasis on rhetoric and speech, so they will tend to put in maybe a quote or a very brief introduction. But either way, you're looking at just a couple of sentences at the most, because you need to start moving on to the substance of your case, and then you actually state the resolution and move on. The next part, and the subject of this sort of segment of the video, is the value and the criterion. And this is going to be one of those parts where I said earlier we're going to digress and slow it down. In other videos aimed at debaters that are more experienced, not going to their first tournament, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about what the value and criterion are supposed to do. But this is for folks who are getting ready for their very first tournament. So I think it's really important that we take a minute and slow down and talk about, like, what do the value and the criterion do before we make recommendations on what maybe they should be. Okay, so we're going to slow down and do that, and then next we'll move on and do the definitions and the framework, and then finally, like we said earlier, the contentions. So what are a value and a criterion in the context of a debate case? Well, Lincoln-Douglas debate is what we call value debate. We're debating about propositions of value, whether something is good or bad, right or wrong, justified or unjustified, right? And those ideas of being right and wrong, justified and unjustified, those can be fairly complex. There can be a lot packed into them. So, back in the 1980s, coaches in LD debate had a good idea, which was you need to explicitly state, like, what standard you are holding this thing up to. It's in this case civil disobedience, but it could be anything. It could be reparations, it could be fossil fuel usage, whatever you want it to be. You need to say, like, what standard are you holding it up to when you make claims about it being morally justified? And that is what the value standard does. It's the bar that you say you have to clear to justify a vote for you. In other words, you say, look, we're going to talk about whether something is good or right. How do you measure whether that's true? I'm going to give you a standard. I'm going to say that the standard for moral justification, judge, is something like justice, or it's something like autonomy, or it's something like morality, or any number of other really high-level values that you can aspire to. And then, in my case, I'm going to show you how I achieve that, right? And when I've done that, I'm going to show you that I've won today's round. But that can get pretty dense. So what I want to do is I want to start with an example that is not rooted in a Lincoln Douglas case, just very quickly. And it's the Chick-fil-A example that I use sometimes with new debaters. Okay, this is not a resolution you'd see in LD, but it is one that kind of helps explain sort of how this works. So if we said resolve, Chick-fil-A is the best fast food restaurant. We know what Chick-fil-A is, but what does it mean to say that something is the, quote, best fast food restaurant? And the answer is you're going to need to specify what you value in a fast food restaurant. Even if you're having this argument with your friends, you're going to need to explain, like, what should we value when we decide, the sort of hierarchy of fast food restaurants. And there are a lot of different possibilities. You might say that it's what restaurant has the tastiest food. That's kind of intuitive, right? Or alternatively, you might talk about which restaurant has the best service. Or a third option, you might ask, which one is the most socially responsible? And depending on which one of those values you pick, what should we value in a fast food restaurant, the debate and your case are going to be very different. If you say that the food is the standard, you're going to spend your case arguing about food. If it's service, you're going to talk about friendly service and quick service. Socially responsible, that'd be a very different debate. With Chick-fil-A, you might talk about how they're very charitable, they treat their employees well, or on the other hand, some of the controversial stands that their ownership has taken on social issues, right? So that is sort of what a value does. It sets the bar and it says, here's what you should look to, judge, in determining whether or not something, in this case, the wording is morally justified, right? Now, in terms of picking a real value, we're obviously not going to use tastiest food. It's going to be something more tangible. So here's a list of sort of frequently used values that we see in Lincoln Douglas debate. And you probably notice that they are all pretty high-level concepts. None of these things are like, getting to work quicker because civil disobedience didn't block the road. None of them are, paying slightly less in taxes or any of that stuff. They're high-level things. You might say, well, Brett, why are they all, these really high-flown things like justice and morality? The idea is that you want your case to link to something that everybody would agree is important, right? If somebody can look at your value and say, so what? I mean, who cares, right? Then it's probably not a very good value. But nobody really looks at justice or morality and says, oh no, those things don't matter. So debaters tend to pick these sort of higher level concerns like justice, morality, fairness. Autonomy has been a big one of late. A lot of debaters argue, for example, that the failure to respect individual autonomy or human dignity has led to great atrocities, so that needs to be the highest value. But you're going to argue that this is the ultimate standard that we need to look to in deciding whether something, in this case, is morally justified, right? And so there are a lot of options in terms of what you can use. And we're going to link in the notes below to several really good online resources, handbooks and papers and things like that talk about values in the context of Lincoln Douglas specifically. And they'll give you a lot of good options. They'll explain some of these values in more detail. They're really good, so take a look at those. Obviously, a 1-hour video is not a substitute for doing the research, so those are a good place to look. But let me make one suggestion, and that's all this is. It's just a suggestion, something we see frequently on this topic, which is sometimes you're able to find a suggestion for what the value ought to be right there in the wording of the resolution. Because remember, when we use a value, we are not just putting it out there and saying, hey, judge, this is what I think is important in my own personal life. Like, this is what I would say is important just, talking to my friends or my parents or my family. We're actually saying this is the valuable thing you should look to in deciding whether the resolution is a true statement or not. Because the basic dividing line in debate is always the affirmative wins if the resolution is a true statement and the negative wins if it's not. Well, it's almost always. There are advanced ways to get around that, but for the most part, right, affirmative wins if it's a true statement. So the value is clarifying, in this case, what it means to be morally justified, or whatever the evaluation term is in whatever resolution you're doing. Well, in this particular resolution, you have two words, morally and justified, right? They're right there in the resolution, and they seem to sort of strongly imply or hint at two of the major values that are used in Lincoln-Douglas debate anyway, which are morality, right, morally, and justice, justified, right there. And so what a lot of debaters do is they pick one of these two standards. Morality may go a little more to the aft, justice may go a little more to the neg, but they're really sort of, they can be used either way, right? They pick these because they can say, look, these values are implied right there in the resolution. So they answer the question that the resolution is asking. So, that's an easy way in around to sort of say my value, if somebody picks a different one, if they pick equality or something like that, it's an easy way to say, Judge, you should prefer my value over theirs because mine is right there in the resolution. So it's answering the question that the resolution asks. Now, am I telling you that these are the only ones you can pick? Absolutely not. People use other ones. They use autonomy, they use dignity, they use equality all the time. And it's very easy to make an argument that links back to the resolution. But this is just one approach that a lot of folks use. If you're a beginner, it may not be a bad way to sort of just pick the sort of simplest default approach and then concern yourself with sort of other things in the case. Now let's talk a little bit about what the criterion is. So the criterion sort of answers kind of an implied question that the judge might have. The judge says, okay, you pick justice for your value. I like justice, everybody likes justice, but justice is a complicated concept. I mean, there are many different conceptions of what justice is. How do I measure whether it's achieved, right? And the criterion is kind of the measuring stick. You say, look, basically, you don't say this, obviously, but the implied statement is, I got you covered, Judge. I'm going to give you a criterion. Criterion just means standard, something to look to as a standard. It's going to be a test that you can use to decide whether justice is achieved. The criterion is a test that the judge can use to determine whether the value is or is not achieved, right? So let me give you an example. I want to walk through an actual example with a value, a criterion, and an actual case behind it, just very briefly. So let's say that you are the affirmative in this case, all right? And you pick a value of justice, and you use the definition of justice that many people do, which is giving each person his or her due. One criterion that you might use, it's very commonly used on this resolution, is something called John Rawls' theory of distributive justice, right? Let me explain what it means and how it provides a test for justice and civil disobedience. So John Rawls said that justice requires meeting the needs of the least advantaged first, because basically they have the most to lose. A homeless person who might be on the verge of starvation has a lot to lose. They have their life to lose if they're not taken care of, right? Whereas, Mark Zuckerberg or somebody, if their needs aren't met, immediately they have many, many resources at their disposal to take care of it. So what Rawls said is the only way to make moral decisions is to step behind what's called an imaginary veil of ignorance. And this is not a real thing. It's an imaginary mental state where you pretend that you don't know your place in society. You don't know your gender, your race, your wealth, whether you have a disability. You don't know any of that stuff. And if you did that, if you pretended you didn't know your place, you would logically choose to protect the least advantaged first because they have the most to lose. You'd be worried, oh my gosh, if I end up, rolling the dice and I'm Mark Zuckerberg, well, then I'm okay. But if I end up rolling the dice and I'm a homeless person who's on the verge of death, well, if society isn't set up to help me and to do the things to vindicate my rights, then that'd be bad, right? So that would be your criterion. You would say the standard judge for justice is meeting the needs of the least advantaged. And then you would spend your case, right, your whole case, making different arguments, contentions, right, about why civil disobedience historically has and today does meet the needs of the least advantaged, that it's used by oppressed minorities, it's used by marginalized groups, it was used in the American Civil Rights Movement, Gandhi and the Salt March, and then use current examples, and you would illustrate how it is necessary to protect the least advantaged, right? And so that is an example of how you give the judge a standard, a test for meeting the value. This leads to one important point, which is you need to remember that your case is one logical chain. So often what we see with young debaters on this topic and other topics is they go pick a value, right? They pick a criterion, and then they just forget them. They just abandon them. They'll say that the standard is justice and that the criterion is helping the least advantaged, and then they'll just go off and run a case about how civil disobedience is sort of generically good, like it's just sort of a generally good thing, it has some nice consequences, but they won't bother to link it back to their criterion. And if that's the case, you haven't connected the logical chain, right? The whole point of going in all these steps is we're going to connect a logical chain up to this important value and achieve this important value. And when we've done that, we'll be justified in asking the judge to vote for us. So your contention level arguments show how you meet the criterion. You know, civil disobedience has helped the least advantaged in the civil rights movement. And the criterion explains how you meet the value, and the value justifies a vote for you on the ballot, which is really ultimately the game that we play in debate. It's a game to see who can get the judge to write their name in the winner's box in the ballot, ethically and morally and in a just, fair, considerate way, but still. So having said all that, you know, a couple of possible criteria, and again, these are just suggestions. You will be a better debater if you go out and do your own research on these things and you come up with your own ideas and you have a bit of creativity. But two suggestions is, you know, when you're the affirmative, we already talked about Rawls's theory of distributive justice. This is a very commonly cited philosophical theory that is used all the time, and it's aimed at helping the least advantaged. It's sort of a naturally nice fit to civil disobedience, which is very frequently used by people in disadvantaged, marginalized positions to achieve basic rights, like basic protections, civil rights, and things like that, right? Basic needs, like the SALT March, right? So it fits very nicely. It's a good starting criterion to pair usually with justice, right, as a value. When you're on the negative, a very commonly used criterion, usually to go with morality as a value, or it can go either way, but it's Kant's categorical imperative. Immanuel Kant basically said that we judge the morality of an action by whether it could be made into a universal law. So you remember earlier we talked about what if everybody did it? Well, Kant says that if you can't make a universal maxim out of your actions, if everybody couldn't do it, then you can't say that it is a morally justified thing, that it is, you know, an acceptable thing. Well, that fits very nicely with the negative, because one argument you can make is, look, if everybody did civil disobedience, if everybody felt at liberty to violate the law, even peacefully, even non-violently, whenever they disagreed with it, well, society couldn't function, right? It couldn't take care of the basic needs that people have, their basic rights. And so that sort of seems to fit fairly well with the general argument on the negative. So those are just a few possibilities, you know, justice, morality, Rawls, Kant. We're going to put links to some very good sources. Another one that I didn't mention was there is a very good value criterion handbook produced by the Victory Briefs that's available online. So I'm going to put that in the links below, and it will explain a lot of different options like Rawls and Kant and others that you might use for a value criterion. But hopefully now you have an understanding of like what the function is of the value and the criterion in the case, and you understand that the idea is to give the judge a standard and say, here's what I'm going to show is important. Here's how I'm going to show that civil disobedience either meets this or doesn't meet this, if you're the negative, right? And that's going to be the justification for why you're going to want to vote for either the app or the neg in this round. So with that, the next thing we need to cover a little bit more briefly is definitions, because the definitions show exactly kind of what the boundaries and the goal line are in the case, like what you actually have to prove. What specifically is civil disobedience? What is a democracy? And that becomes really important as you continue developing your case. Okay, so last stop before we actually get to sort of the substantive arguments on the resolution is talking about definitions and framework. And this is a really important part of being a good debater, and it's one that's kind of underrated among a lot of people who are new to the activity. And you might ask yourself, so why is it that definitions are so important? And the answer is that they move the goal line. Right, so I've got a picture of a football field here, and I try to use sports analogies sparingly because I know not everybody's a fan, but I think most people know that in football, if you want to score a touchdown, you have to cross the line at the end of the field, the goal line, and if you cross it, you score, and if you don't, you don't, right? And in debate, if you are the affirmative, the goal line is sort of proving to the judge that the resolution is a true statement, and if you're the negative, it's you stop the affirmative from doing that. Right, so that is that's the sort of line that you have to cross. Well, when your high school football team goes and plays a game, they don't get to change where the goal line is. It's where it is. It's not moving, right? It's set. It's there on the field. But in debate, when we talk about the resolution being a goal line, we actually debate about like what the resolution means and can therefore move the goal line. If you're the affirmative, you can move it closer so that it is easier to win. And if you're the negative, you can try to move it farther away. And the way you generally do that, for the most part, is with definitions and to some extent with things like observations and framework. So these are really important. Now, I'll add a caveat at the very beginning, which is that you have to do this in an ethical way. You have to do this in a fair way. Abusive definitions are a very quick ticket to losing a ballot with an experienced judge. If you try to come in and say, for example, you're the negative and you say that civil disobedience means like you can just break the law whenever you want with no consequences, well, that's clearly not what it means, right? That's clearly not the case. And in many instances, experienced judges would vote you down and vote against you for trying to be abusive. But within the bounds of fairness and within the bounds of what the literature and the material out there actually says, choosing different definitions can be of great strategic importance, okay? And so let's talk about why that is, okay? So first of all, you might be wondering, like, what do I actually need to define in the resolution? If you're new to debate, it might not be immediately apparent. There's three basic things that you almost always want to define, and they are the object of evaluation. That is the thing that we are testing, evaluating. In this case, it's civil disobedience, right? Obviously, you're going to want to define that. That's the main thing. The second thing, if you'll look a little further down, is we ask ourselves, how are we evaluating that thing? Well, we use what's called an evaluative term. And the evaluative term here is justified, right? Now, both of those can have modifiers. So you're going to want to define the object of evaluation in the evaluative term, but also define the modifiers. So a really important modifier of civil disobedience is in a democracy, right? Because that's going to limit the examples and illustrations that are topical in the debate. And when I say topical, that is just a fancy debate word for new folks. It just means relevant. It just means covered by the resolution. So if you have an opponent or a coach who's saying something is topical or non-topical, that just means that it either falls within the resolution and is topical, or it falls outside, it's not covered, and it's not topical. So for example, on this one, if you were using examples of civil disobedience, like in the former Soviet Union, which was absolutely not a democracy, someone might say that's non-topical, right? So the definitions of these terms are important. And also we have morally, modifying, justified. And you probably are going to want to think about defining all four of those terms just to err on the side of caution. I generally advise young debaters to go ahead and define all the major terms, even if you don't think you're necessarily going to use it, because sometimes, particularly among young debaters, people try to get a little cheap, and if you don't have a definition, they'll say that their definition is the only one in the round and has to be accepted. So at least early on, and before you get sort of more sophisticated with some of your theory and stuff, you might just want to go ahead and define each one of these terms. It doesn't take too long to do. So those are the big four: civil disobedience, democracy, justified, and morally. And there are great, sources out there. We'll put some in the links below about places you can go to look for possible definitions. They're not always going to be dictionary definitions. A lot of times, as you'll see, we use sort of more advanced sources like scholars to get better, more specific definitions. So let's talk about how the details of these definitions matter, about how just throwing out a dictionary definition might not always be the best idea. Let's start with the definition of civil disobedience, okay? So let's say that you're the affirmative, right? And you are trying to show that civil disobedience is justified. Looking at these two definitions, which of the two do you think would be more favorable for you and easier to defend? I'm going to suggest, I gave you a second there, I'm going to suggest that it probably would be the first of the two, right? And let me explain why. You may already see why, right? The second one from Eric Zashin of Columbia just says deliberate and public violation of laws or legal commands on the grounds that they're unjust, okay? The first one from the Stanford Dictionary of Philosophy is conscious public nonviolent breaking of a law to protest an injustice and accepting the legal consequences thereof. So as you can see, that's a much more limited definition. That is there are many more qualifiers and limitations on it. It has to be nonviolent, right? It has to accept the legal consequences. So if you're the affirmative and you want to say civil disobedience is good, Well, in this case, it's going to be saying that, it's more intuitively acceptable to most people if it's not violent, if you're not resisting arrest, if you're not fighting with the police, if you're accepting the consequences. Most people would feel on a gut level that that's more defensible. So you as the affirmative are going to want to prefer that one, right? Now, if you're the negative, you might love the Zashin definition because, it doesn't talk about nonviolence, and it at least leaves open the possibility that, hey, maybe there is such a thing as violent civil disobedience. And I will tell you that out there in the literature, there are at least a few people who suggest that civil disobedience can be violent. That's a minority position. Most people don't say that. And I would suggest that in many instances, you as the negative probably have to be ready to accept the idea that nonviolence is kind of a part of civil disobedience. But the argument might be, why affirmatively make that argument for the other side, right? So two different definitions that vary the scope of civil disobedience, one of which narrows it, makes it more limited, makes it less likely to encompass violence, and therefore, if you're the affirmative, it moves the goal line closer. So hopefully you see how a different definition can make your burden easier or harder. By the way, that Stanford definition is a paraphrase of about a page of stuff. I used it for educational purposes in this video because it helped sort of make the point. That's not a direct quote from Stanford, so please don't put that directly in your case. I did summarize it just for the sake of illustrating something. So next, let's talk about democracy, the definition of democracy. Now, you might ask yourself, why would the definition of democracy matter, right? Well, let's go back to that India example I gave earlier, the Salt March, Mohandas Gandhi, right? Well, if the resolution says in a democracy, then that example would be non-topical unless at the time India was a democracy, right? So was it? Well, many people would say, no, of course not. Many negative debaters would say, no, of course not. India was not a democracy. It was a colonial territory. It was governed by the British colonial powers. However, as it turns out, in 1919, Britain passed the Indian Government Act, which actually gave certain local authority to elected representatives elected by propertied males in India. And they did have a certain measure of authority over policies. Now, the British Crown could veto it or override it very easily if they wanted to, but at least on many local issues, Indian people could elect their own leaders who had a certain measure of power. And so whether or not India is a democracy would depend on which definition you use. If you use the Collins Dictionary definition, which just says people choose their rulers by voting for them, well, did they do that in India? Yeah, they did, right? So that might be, you might be able to use it. On the other hand, if you use this much more involved definition from Professor Wilmore Kendall of Yale, you've got to have popular sovereignty. Well, if the British Crown can override what your elected representatives do, then that's not popular sovereignty. Sovereignty means ultimate authority. And the populace was not sovereign. Political equality. Did you have political equality in colonial India? Of course not. I mean, the British authorities had total dominion ultimately over a subjugated people. So it wouldn't meet that definition. So hopefully you can see how the definition that you choose, in this case for democracy, would directly affect which examples you could use. And you could also say this about the American Civil Rights Movement. Was America, the United States of America, was it overall a functioning democracy in the 50s and 60s? Yes. But for African Americans in the South, the people who were doing most of the civil disobedience, they were barred from the ability to vote by things like these ridiculous literacy tests and violence by the Ku Klux Klan. So an argument could be that there really wasn't political equality there, and that they weren't really living in a democracy, at least not for them. So that debate is something that affects what evidence is relevant and topical in the debate. Now, there are a couple of other things we could talk about, when it comes to definitions. I could spend a little time on frameworks and observations. Observations are sort of general overviews of what's relevant to the topic that don't necessarily focus on one specific word, but more on sort of the structure of the resolution or maybe what's fair. So, for example, there's a resolution that affirmatives sometimes use. I call it the tool in a toolbox observation, and they will say, basically that. I, as the affirmative, shouldn't have to prove that civil disobedience is justified in every single case because that's impossible. Literally nothing is justified in every case, like even Superman occasionally turns evil and does bad things, right? All I should have to do is show you that overall civil disobedience belongs in our toolbox of democratic policymaking. It belongs in our arsenal. It's something that should be an option, right? We should keep it on the table as a possibility, right? That's one observation that you see frequently. I don't know that at this point in your career as a brand new debater you want to get too deep into that, but observations do exist in addition to definitions of specific words. And then finally, there are other words in the resolution that could be an issue. For example, is. Is in the present tense. So some clever debater might say that because is in the present tense, that means we should be focusing on civil disobedience today and not focusing on civil disobedience like in the distant past or 50 or 80 years ago, and therefore we should focus on a world where maybe social media makes it easier to make your points, that sort of thing. But all of the words in the resolution are up for grabs, and hopefully now you can see that the way we define these words and the way that we take care to define them in a way that's advantageous to us can really make a big difference in what arguments you can make. So now, having done that, we've kind of done all the prerequisites, so we will turn to probably the part you've been waiting for, which is the substantive arguments, the things that we frequently see when we're actually debating about civil disobedience. So we'll turn to that right now. All right, so we have made it all the way through the definitions, through the value criteria, through all the preliminary stuff, and now it's time to start talking about some of the fundamental, basic, substantive arguments that you're going to use, that many people use in debating about civil disobedience and debating this resolution. I want to say at the outset that there is no way in any video, much less the remaining 20 or so minutes that we have, that we could cover all of the possible arguments. There are hundreds of different angles and sources and arguments and permutations that you could use in debating about civil disobedience. And luckily, there are tons of great materials out there online. Handbooks, guides, briefs from companies and universities and individuals and blogs and all these things that are out there that give you plenty of options. You do not have to invent the research on this topic from scratch, which is a good thing. And you're going to need to read those things. Our goal is not to kind of replicate them. And I will say this, by the way, as an aside, I don't mean to sound like, sort of the curmudgeonly old debate coach here, but debate takes work, okay? It is an activity where you get out what you put in, and you don't have to do it like a full-time job, but you do have to put in the effort to read and research on your own. If you want to put in, just an hour of kind of skimming stuff, the week before the tournament, you're probably going to have a bad time, as they say, in actually competing. So just resolve now that you're going to put in the work to do the research and the reading, to ask questions, and to get better, and you'll have a lot more fun and you'll do a lot better. But what we want to do here is not to try to list every possible argument, but to talk about certain various categories of arguments that are likely to come up, that have come up in the past, and to sort of lay out some of the strengths and weaknesses and some of the general considerations so that you can go in and make good informed decisions about which specific arguments you want to use in your case. Because the worst thing would be for you to spend all this time, setting up a good strategic position with good value, good criterion, good definitions, and then just go pick 3 random arguments and throw them out there and have the case not fit together as a cohesive whole, right? So we're going to look at them, we're going to talk about them critically, offer some responses, tell you some of the strengths and weaknesses, and hopefully you'll be in a better position to pick strategically what arguments you want to advance in the round. So let's get started with the affirmative, and we'll take a look at first a general category of arguments on moral obligation. This is something that pops up in a lot of cases, and the basic argument is that there's an idea that there is no moral obligation to obey unjust laws. And this comes from a lot of different sources, but for example, one of them is Professor Ronald Dworkin. So if you want to Google that, we're going to put a lot of links to these different handbooks and things, and you can probably find this quote in one of them, but his name is Ronald Dworkin. And he basically writes that there is no moral obligation to obey unjust laws, right? I mean, if a law is fundamentally unjust, maybe not just unwise, like maybe the taxes are a little too high, but fundamentally unjust, like segregation, like laws that oppress people, like laws that fundamentally destroy the environment, some people might say, that you don't have an obligation to obey them. or rather, I think he would probably put it more precisely this way: you have an obligation to obey them, but you have a higher obligation to morality and to your conscience and to the rest of humanity that actually goes above and beyond, right, just your obligation to the government. And so what he says is civil disobedience is actually a really good way to resolve that conflict, right? You have two different obligations. Civil disobedience kind of lets you do both in a sense. On the one hand, you don't follow the law, right? So you are upholding your obligation to humanity and to your conscience and to morality to not, go along with things like, a racist law or segregation or something like that. On the other hand, you are accepting the consequences, right? You are, peacefully protesting. You are peacefully accepting the consequences. You are probably, going to jail. You may be prosecuted for it, right? But in that way, you sort of keep your obligation both to yourself and your conscience, but also to the state, to the government. And that's sort of the argument there. Now, there's an even stronger variant of this argument that is made by several folks. Peter Singer, who's a really prominent moral philosopher, made it in an article, I think about 2002. And he basically said, not only is there no moral obligation to obey unjust laws, there's actually a moral obligation not to obey unjust laws. And what they basically say, what he says, and Dr. Martin Luther King has written the same thing in probably more eloquent words, but still the same idea, which is that if you obey unjust laws and you sort of get along to go along and you keep your head down and you don't say anything, like a lot of people, mostly white folks in the South did during segregation, just sort of, go along with it, then you're actually making it easier for the government to engage in unjust activities and to engage in oppression. For every person, here in Mississippi where we are, who sort of, maybe they didn't like the idea of segregation, but they didn't want to say anything about it. They didn't want to protest it. They didn't want to go and do the lunch counter sit-ins or anything like that. Every time you fail to act, you actually make it easier for an oppressive government to do these things. And so these are two different variations on the idea that you either have no moral obligation to follow unjust laws, or you actually have a moral obligation not to. And I would say for most affirmatives, some variation on this argument, some argument that goes to the fundamental issue of moral duty, right, is important. Examples are great, illustrations are great, practical benefits of civil disobedience are great, but in Lincoln-Douglas debate, where we're talking about fundamental values, it really is important to have at least one contention, at least some part of your case that links back to this fundamental idea of moral obligation. So the next sort of broad category of arguments for the affirmative would be examples, like we said earlier, of opposing different specific injustices. Now, the one we talked about at length before was obviously the civil rights movement. We're not going to go back and rehash that, but many cases include specific examples of Rosa Parks and lunch counter sit-ins and things like that. Many mention Indian colonialism. Many mention other movements in which civil disobedience was key: the environmental movement in the U.S., the anti-war movement during the war in Vietnam in the U.S., the women's suffrage movement. All of these had civil disobedience as an element. And I think for illustrating the impact of civil disobedience, it is good to have these things in your case. In fact, one thing I would say to both sides is be ready to offer multiple illustrations of civil disobedience on your side or on the other side, right, in the case. Because one of the most frequent cross-examination questions I get, if a debater is not prepared for it, could be harmful, is, okay, you've given these two examples of, say, the civil rights movement in India. What are some more current examples of civil disobedience? Is there anything going on today where it's necessary? And many times you'll see new debaters, they're stumped. So you're going to want to make sure you have these in your quiver, probably mentioned somewhere in your case. But I will say this, you have to be careful, right? Because just because civil disobedience happened as a part of the civil rights movement, that doesn't necessarily mean that all of the benefits of the civil rights movement, all of the increase in justice and fairness that came about as a result, can be traced to civil disobedience. One smart negative argument would be to say, wait a minute, there is a correlation between civil disobedience and civil rights in the United States. But there's no evidence that one caused the other. I've heard really good negative debaters, very impressive young debaters, say basically, look, the civil rights movement had all kinds of things. It had protest marches. They were not civil disobedience. They didn't involve breaking the law. It was just like the March on Washington was just that, a march. They had litigation, like Brown versus Board of Education, challenging in the courts segregation. They had legislation, like the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They had, numerous other things, like the Montgomery bus boycott. That was not civil disobedience, right? It was spurred by civil disobedience by Rosa Parks, but it itself was not civil disobedience. Right, and so all of these things happen, and actually, what one of these debaters said was very few of the major incidents in the civil rights movement were civil disobedience. Only a few were. So how do you, as the AF, prove, right, that it was civil disobedience that led to civil rights? And you want to have a good answer for that. There are ways to argue that it's important. There are sources out there that say it was important, but you need to make sure you do your research and you're able to answer the question, so you're not just saying, well, there was some civil disobedience and then we had the Civil Rights Act passed. You have to show a connection between the two. And that ability to show the connection through evidence is something that's really important at all levels of debate, and especially in Lincoln Douglas debate. So just be aware of that as a possible response. And if you're the negative, be ready to offer that response. How do you know that it was these relative handful of instances of civil disobedience, as opposed to the many marches and the many court cases that were filed and all these other things that actually secured these benefits for people? Hopefully that makes sense. Lastly, and I think some of these are important, these are sort of, I wouldn't call them squirrel contentions. A squirrel contention is sort of an argument that's a little bit different, a little bit out of the norm to try to sort of distract your opponent. I think they're all legitimate, but they are a little bit outside of sort of the major narrative. Some of them are anyway. The practical benefits of civil disobedience, right? And so, for example, you have arguments about how civil disobedience is a prerequisite to other human rights. And there's this very good quote and passage by an author named Susan Tiefenbrunn, I think that's how you pronounce it. And it's probably in some of the sources we'll link to, about how the right to rebel is the prerequisite to all human rights. Like, you don't get any human rights anywhere in the world unless there is a recognized right to push back and to rebel to a certain extent against oppressive and unjust governments. So that's a nice way to try to link to other human rights. Civil disobedience fosters improved dialogue. This is from an author named Kathy Gelber in 2002, and it basically says that civil disobedience may be the only way to force a government that doesn't want to have a conversation to have a conversation about a form of oppression or a form of injustice, and how lunch counter sit-ins, for example, forced southern states to have this conversation. There is a third argument, which is that civil disobedience is a pressure release valve. Basically, like, if you don't recognize civil disobedience as being acceptable, it's not like these objections and these protests are just going to go away. They're not, right? What's going to happen is it's just going to boil over to the point where you get open rebellion, like violent rebellion, right? And so this is actually a nice argument to have, either as a contention or rebuttal, because it kind of preemptively answers some of the negatives, likely criticisms, where you say, look, however bad you may think some of the consequences of civil disobedience are, they're nothing compared to what you would get without it, which is you would get like violent revolution. So you want this as sort of a pressure release valve to let off some of that steam and to try to reach a constructive solution before everything blows up. And the last one, and as an attorney, I didn't mention that, but that's my trade. I'm a legal compliance officer here at Mississippi State. But as a lawyer, I love this one, is that civil disobedience is actually necessary to initiate legal challenges. In the United States, we have something called Article 3 of the Constitution, and it basically says you can't just bring hypothetical arguments into courts of law. You actually have to have something bad happen to have what's called standing, right, to sue, standing to sue. And so you actually have to have a law broken if you think it's unjust, right, in many instances, not always, but in many instances, to bring a lawsuit. And so there are examples of cases where, in order to challenge an unjust law, somebody had to intentionally break it and then let the challenge be brought in court. And you can Google civil disobedience, Article 3 standing, and we'll have some sources on that. But this is a really nifty argument. It says, if you want to have things like these court cases that vindicate people's rights, somebody's got to break the law to begin with so that the law can be changed in court. Right, so those are sort of the three big categories of affirmative arguments. Now let's move on and talk about some of the three or four big categories of negative arguments. So the first one is just going to be, as we talked about before, this idea of a categorical imperative that comes to us from Immanuel Kant. This idea that if it's not okay for everybody in all circumstances, if you can't make a universal rule out of it, then you can't say, that it's okay for some people. You can't say it's morally justified. And so the first one is one we've already talked about. If everybody violated the laws they disagreed with, society couldn't function. There's plenty of evidence about this. But in addition to sort of saying, well, if everybody violated the law, the police would be overburdened, you can actually extrapolate this to some really troubling arguments. There's literature out there about how, like, for example, if the rich decided that they didn't want to pay taxes. They say, look, we pay 50% or more of all the income taxes. We're tired of it. We've just decided we're not going to pay taxes. And by the way, not paying taxes is a classical form of civil disobedience. I think it was Thoreau, right, who initially refused to pay taxes to fund a war that he felt was unjust. Well, if they did that, there's a strong argument that, like, the IRS doesn't have nearly enough personnel to go and enforce it. Like, they wouldn't be able to go out and prosecute all these people. There'd be millions and millions of them. There's nothing we could do. So if you imagine a world where basic government services get, like, shut down because people engage in civil disobedience, even a fraction of society did it, right? Much less all. You can see some really distressing scenarios. And Kant would say, we can't say that's moral because everybody can't do it. And then the next one, if an action isn't universally moral, it can't be moral in some instances. It can't be moral for some people and not moral for others. You can't pick and choose. And then finally, I think this is an important one. It's just a sort of a theme that I like to use with negative debaters when I coach them. Civil disobedience is a morally neutral tool that can be used for good or evil. And I often find that in debate, it's necessary to sort of reframe. If you're going to say that something is not good or just, right? It's often necessary to reframe it and say, well, if it's not good or just, what is it? And one way to do that is to say, well, it's bad, right? But it's very hard to make an argument that civil disobedience is, like, categorically bad. There clearly have been some cases where it's done some good things. So the way that I suggest to reframe it is when you're talking to the judge, you say over and over again, civil disobedience is not morally justified. It's like a hammer. Right? It's a morally neutral tool. You can use it for good, like Rosa Parks, or you can use it for evil, like George Wallace. And if something is a morally neutral tool, we don't say that a hammer is morally justified. We don't say that a screwdriver is morally justified. We say that it's morally neutral. And so one thing you can say as the negative is, if I can prove to you, Judge, that civil disobedience is just morally neutral, then it's not morally justified, and you have to vote negative as opposed to voting affirmative, right? That's a very, I think, strong tactic to kind of reframe exactly what you're trying to prove as a negative. You're not some Scrooge that's like trying to say civil disobedience is always bad. You're saying it's morally neutral. It can be good or bad, and therefore the resolution is not true and shouldn't be affirmed. Next set of arguments is the social contract. We didn't really talk about this, but a very common piece of philosophy used in Lincoln-Douglas debate is the idea of a social contract, which is basically that you as a citizen or a resident, right, agree to abide by the laws, and the government agrees to uphold, certain basic obligations to protect you. And there are many different versions by Locke, by Hobbes, by Rousseau, different variations on it, but it's this idea that you have an agreement, we have a contract. You obey the laws, we protect you. And so one very simple argument for the negative is that civil disobedience breaks that contract. If you go around breaking the laws you don't like, as opposed to using legal channels like lobbying, like litigation, like persuasion to change the law, then you have broken the social contract. You've broken the fundamental agreement that creates our society, right? It endangers the legitimacy of our society. And so that's the basic argument. There's a bunch of strong responses to this, though. For example, Peter Suber back in 1999 had a really good, sort of article, well, not really an article, but a digression discussing how if the government is passing unjust laws, then they broke the contract, right? Their contract was to be a just government, to take care of people and be just. And if they're not doing that, well then, they broke the contract, and when one party breaks a contract, the other party is then relieved of their duty to follow the contract as well. So it was the government that broke it, not the civil disobedient. And then also Paul Power, I don't have the date on this, but I'm sure it's in one of these links that we have, basically says that civil disobedience actually isn't breaking the contract at any rate, right? He says that, like, If you accept the consequences of your action, if you accept that you might be arrested for sitting down at the lunch counter or laying down the street or whatever, right? And you agree to go to jail, well, that is the deal that society put in its laws. It said you either, follow the law or you go to jail. And as long as you peacefully go to jail, you may have broken the law, right? You broke a specific law, but you didn't break the fundamental societal contract. And so those are two really good, I think, responses to social contract arguments that I would have ready, if I were debating as a negative debater. And then, next we have the idea that civil disobedience is somewhat unnecessary. And again, this goes back to the argument I made earlier, which is affirmative, like what evidence do you have that it really was civil disobedience that was necessary to the civil rights movement, necessary to women's suffrage, necessary to the anti-war movement? You need to provide some evidence as the affirmative that these things were really, they wouldn't have happened but for civil disobedience. And there's a very strong argument that it was actually other things like lawful protests and stuff that actually made the difference, in the civil rights movement in particular. And then further, as we talked about a little earlier, maybe technology has rendered civil disobedience obsolete. It may be that back in the 1950s and 60s, the only way to draw attention was to get the newspaper to cover things, and the only way to get the newspaper to cover was to do it something fairly dramatic, go out and get arrested and cause a scene, right? But today we have so many avenues from Twitter to Facebook, change.org, fundraising, that, it's obsolete. And people would point to, for example, the movement for marriage equality for same-sex couples. That was a movement based around persuasion, social media, litigation was a huge part of it, obviously. It really didn't involve very much, if any, civil disobedience, and it's been one of the most successful, civil rights movements in recent memory. So some people would say, look, if justification depends on it being necessary to do these good consequences, well, it's not, right? We don't need it anymore, so it can't be justified. And then finally, last but not least, the practical harms of civil disobedience. The biggest one here that I wanted to talk about is the idea that civil disobedience undermines the rule of law, right? And that hurting the rule of law hurts the poor and the disadvantaged most. David Allen Green in 2012 wrote that the rule of law, right, is actually something that benefits the poor and the disadvantaged more than the rich. The rich have the ability to go out and curry influence, to take care of themselves. In some extreme cases, some of them go out and buy up these remote compounds just in case the government collapses. They can take care of themselves, right? They can vindicate their own interest. The law is in the interest of protecting those who are not powerful, right? And respecting the law because it is the law, right? Nobody's above the law. Nobody has enough power or influence. Nobody can yell loud enough that the law is overcome. That's actually meant to protect the poor and the disadvantaged and the least advantaged in society, as Rawls would say, first. So this is an argument that, every time you do civil disobedience, you contribute to the idea that the law really isn't the final say, right? That if you really, really feel strongly enough, you can just break the law. And while it might be used to help the poor in many instances, you can certainly envision scenarios like, for example, the rich boycotting paying taxes, right? Where it could be used to harm the poor and the least advantaged pretty dramatically, right? And so that is kind of an overview and a survey of some of the different arguments, some of the strengths and weaknesses that you see. It wasn't meant to be exhaustive. It wasn't meant to be comprehensive. In the links, you are going to find very exhaustive and very comprehensive different, sources and different repositories of information. And like I said earlier, you got to get out there and you got to do the reading and you got to do the research. That process, right? That process of doing the reading and doing the research, it will make you a better debater, right? If somebody just hands you a great case and you just go in and read it, you're not going to do well at a tournament. But if you go through the hard work and write a pretty good case, but it's your case, right, and you put it together yourself, you're going to do better. As I tell my debaters, there's a reason why in the Star Wars universe they make the young Jedi Padawans build their own lightsaber. They make them go and build their own lightsaber. And the reason is because you've got to know how that weapon works, right? You've got to know it backwards and forwards. And if you build it yourself, you'll know it, right? And it's the same thing with your case. So anyway, thanks so much for spending some time with us. I really enjoyed talking about this topic. Like I said earlier, if it's helpful, give us a like. If you find it useful, maybe to keep up with what's going on LD and PF, subscribe. Obviously, if this was helpful to you, feel free to pass it on to other folks, show it to a class, whatever you think might be useful. But we will be back on every topic going forward. And if you've got questions, drop them in the comments. But we're hoping that you will have a great first tournament, and best of luck. And we'll see you out there on the competitive trail.